The reason it's such a critical element is that you are inherently introducing risk, right, to what you do today. Being the first to do something requires you to be over-invested in doing it. It's uncomfortable to be the one to help uncover the challenges. What you find is that middle layer is very good at supporting the teams below, but not very good at pushing back up, right, and saying, make a choice. When someone pushes something down the road, whether they know it consciously or not, they've made a decision. Being able to facilitate that discussion with your team and then present it back to people above you is the skill.
If you're trying to drive digital transformation in your practice, then this episode of Counting on Change will be invaluable. Ket Patel is a professional change manager with more than 12 years of experience of leading change and transformation within the finance, tech, and consulting industries. He's a volunteer and former co-lead of the UK chapter of the Change Management Institute and has worked with the likes of EY, the Home Office, the International Coaching Federation, and the Cecil Housing Trust. And one of the things that strikes me most about Ket's approach to change is that it's rooted very deeply in what works in the real world and not simply in theoretical models. I know so many practice leaders and cloud champions that struggle to find the momentum that they need in their projects, and I'm sure that Ket can provide insights that will unlock enormous potential for you. Now, the best place to start is usually at the beginning, so I started by asking Ket how a person can go about winning early support for an idea that will improve their organisation.
For people that are stuck in that situation where they're just sort of banging the drum but it's going nowhere, what sort of things have you found that have been effective to start to sort of perpetuate a bit of buy-in to at least get it looked at seriously to begin with?
I think there are two things, right, from a business perspective that always kind of crop up. One is, what strategic or business risk are we trying to mitigate against, right? Because I think I always imagine that kind of head in the sand moment, right, when something comes along. If your head's in the sand, you're just ignoring the problem. It's at some point going to hit you, but you're aware of it. If you're just not aware of the situation and it hits you, you kind of have to react to it. So I think by being aware of the risk, by not doing something, you're making an active decision as to whether you're comfortable with the risk materializing at some point in the future. And that's it's a business impact. And so our first thing I always think about is, how important is this to the strategy of the business, and therefore what is the outcome if we do nothing about it? And if you're comfortable, board, sort of leadership team, with that decision, then let's just keep reviewing it, because it is part of the strategy of how our business needs to operate. And if we're going to have to deal with it, we want to be thinking proactively about it, not dealing reactively, because that's when we can make mistakes or make it difficult for ourselves or make it harder than it needs to be. So that's one thing, using it as a risk mitigation, right? Like calling it out and saying, are we actively going to do something now or not? I think the second thing, from a sort of practical perspective, has been, how can we show, if we do something now, even if it's small, it adds value over what we're doing currently? So how can we prove this isn't as big a thing as we want, or it's going to add the value we expect it to? And what I'm talking about is, are there opportunities to prototype or learn from others and show how this is adding value so that others can see it happen? I'll give you an example which is sort of disconnected, but change management wasn't a common thing in the business I was working in. Project management was, but no one had any airtime for the reason change management needed to be part of the skill set of running projects. So what I did is I started to layer in activities that would help us with some of the issues we were facing in post go live, which were sort of change management activities. I didn't call them change management activities. And then the feedback we got better feedback on those projects for the people that were impacted. And that created interest from others who were having similar issues to us to try and adopt what we were doing. And before we knew it, there was a little bit of momentum behind that. So starting small and proving it has value, if possible, is a good way of being able to get sort of a social movement behind something, or getting more people interested in it. And I think, it's how ideas typically kind of spread anyway, right? Like you show it has value in an early group of people, that sort of spreads to a wider group, and you kind of have to keep reinforcing that. So I think they're the two things for me that need to be tackled. Is one, we're actively managing a risk that we as a business need, and two, we're trying at the other end to show that it's going to add value over time and we should take these plays now.
of that idea in the first one, because I think what tends to happen in practice, and I've seen this with firms themselves, is that you've got a decision making. They say, look, should we do this thing or not? And actually saying, well, I'm not going to do it. I think they feel it's just deferring the decision. Let's not make a decision now because we don't know. Whereas actually, if you frame it in that way and say, well, look, if we don't do this, here's a possible impact. If we do this is what it is, which like, I'm going to force you to make a decision. And if that is stick with the status quo, that's fine. But at least you've made a decision there. And I think that could be really impactful in sort of lodging people out of that, well, I'll just push it down the road sort of mindset.
And I think that's the thing that's really sort of key, right? It's like when someone pushes something down the road, they have, whether they know it consciously or not, they've made a decision and there is an outcome to that. It's just whether we highlight it or not. And I think more often than not, the more we highlight the do something, do nothing, your trade-off, right? The more we can kind of go, okay, well, there's an active decision being made here, and that's cool. Let's go with it and let's revisit if we want to. And I think that's really how you get to people to kind of start to engage with it, right? Because they own the decision then.
Yeah, definitely. And so on that second point around trying to start small and just sort of build that sort of group or start to, I guess, develop that movement, would you, if I'm a kind of junior manager or whatever in an accounting practice, do you think it's a better idea for me to try and do that a little bit under the radar? Or do you think I should go and get that properly sanctioned by a senior leader and go, look, I'm going to try this small first. Would you give it your blessing? Or would you just sort of do the, kind of seek forgiveness later sort of thing?
If I've got within my remit to try something at my own, with my own energy and effort without disrupting the business, one, I shouldn't need permission to do it. I don't feel, right? Like I'm trying to improve something in the business for the business's benefit. And two, if I do, there's probably red tape, which is just going to slow me down and lose my interest in it anyway, right? So I kind of feel like either way, the right thing to do is try. Right, being mindful. Don't just go off on my own harebrained scheme and just do something. Like try and get a little bit of consensus as to how, within a small group. But I think, trying something, whether that's like as simple as going to talk to another organisation that's implemented something you're thinking about doing, right, and seeing some of their pitfalls. What does that cost you? Right, it doesn't really cost you anything. So I think. I definitely say try stuff, right? Obviously with managing business risk in the front of your mind, and then prove the case for it. And I think, that would be my approach. I hope it doesn't land anyone in trouble.
I think that the sort of the benefit of the sort of world that we're in over this side in the accounting world is you're dealing with software subscriptions that are 20 quid a month. And often you can kick that off with just conversations with the client. You can probably try and get yourself a free trial of something, speak to a client about it, see how that lands. So there's definitely little things that you can start to do. And I think particularly in the more sort of tech savvy accounting community, there are lots of events and things like that where you can meet up with other champions that are maybe a bit further down the road. So that idea of what has another business done? Yeah, in that sort of community, there's quite a good degree of openness, I think, and there's definitely a positive for that group.
If I'm reflect on what it takes to be that sort of push new ideas, right? I do think it requires you to be very hands-on. It requires you to be in the detail and want to kind of deal with problems and recognize problems might occur. Because I think that's where it can be dangerous or difficult, right? If you go down a path with, say, a supplier or a vendor or a temporary subscription of something, and all of a sudden you get into the weeds of the complexity of actually implementing it, and that's where you go, oh god, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I think that's when you've almost got to be committed that you know that this is the right thing to be doing. It's going to be difficult, and therefore you've got to have the capacity and motivation to push it through. And if you can do that, then you'll see the rewards. And if you haven't necessarily got the time or energy to do that on your own, try and find others to do it with, or maybe don't do it at that particular time. But it requires that. Being the first to do something requires you to be over invested in doing it, and making it work, no matter what comes, right? And I think that's really important going into that kind of like, should I try something or not? You want to prove that it's going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Otherwise, your sort of lack of energy to it sort of then becomes evidence that the entire concept doesn't work instead. So that's
Absolutely,
a great point. Typically in firms, what we see is, and I guess you will see this in most of these sorts of projects, right? It's just an insufficient level of communication, right? There's this assumption that people will get it, and I think from my experience anyway, not as fast as yours, but that a lot of problems are solved with just communicate a bit more. Is that what you found in these large scale projects?
I've been frustrated sometimes by the amount of communication we have done, and yet it's still not necessarily hit the right people at the right time.
Okay.
And I think when I've been in those situations, I've always had to step back and go, people are busy, like people are 100% occupied. I use this sort of phrase all the time, right? If I talk to anyone that's being impacted by change, they're already doing their day job, right? And probably stuff on top of that. And there's probably other projects that are asking them for stuff as well. So there's all this demand on them. So my email or my presentation or my kind of new big thing is just not going to resonate with them, right?
Yeah.
To the kind of extent I want it to. So I have to take it on the chin. I'm going to have to repeat my message several times. But I also need to make it succinct, and I also need to make it relevant to them. And what I see as a common sort of pitfall is we're so excited about this change. We tell everybody everything, right? Like, oh, it's going to do this for us. And we kind of set this, again, to expectation. We set this really high expectation about what it's going to achieve. And we fail to connect the real messages to the real people that are impacted by it in a way that's targeted. And the more we do that, and the more we listen to what's kind of reflected back to us, the more we kind of have dialogue as opposed to communication, which is me telling you something. And I think that's the thing, is the whole point of me saying something to you is I kind of want you to understand what I'm saying. And if I don't check that you do, and I don't hear what you think of it, then I'm almost just doing what I want, which is never going to land the change.
Yeah.
So I think for me, communication is central. It is going to be in high volume, but it's got to be targeted, and it's got to be in ways that kind of make it simple and accessible for the people that you're trying to target. And that could be different for different groups, right? I've used small communities of like, Teams chats. We've used full briefings. We've done demos. We've done every mechanism, short videos, in software development videos, all these different things, just to give people access to it in the ways that would be useful to them. So, it's just really understanding what's going to work for the people impacted and then communicating to them in succinct messages.
And that's a whole body of work then that needs to go into that, rather than just, we'll stick it on an email, it'll be fine. And we'll do that time. We'll just repeat it. Like you really got to step back then and think, right, what do people need to know? When do they need to know it? And how's it going to land? And all that sort of stuff, and having a real strategy around that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, a lot of people often do think change management is training and comms. And actually, I'd be relatively happy if more projects did just those two things much better.
Yeah.
In terms of kind of change management, it is more than that. But those two things are quite crucial to getting people ready and set up for success when it comes to change. Now, there's a lot more that goes into it, but those things I think are often, sometimes always, in projects actually kind of, if time pressure's on, that's the things that get cut. They're the things that I was seeing being cut from projects I was running when I was running project management 10 years ago. We haven't got time to train people, we just need to get it out there, they'll figure it out. It's pretty intuitive. I know what you're saying, but you've been in it for 6-9 months, right? You've been looking at it, you've worked with a vendor, we make a lot of assumptions on behalf of people, and I think we just need to be not doing that, and we need to talk to people and create dialogue through our communications.
I find a really interesting dynamic, and experienced it myself with software, even if it's intuitive, is that you probably can figure it out and operate it in an effective way, but there's always that nagging doubt in the back of your mind of, am I doing it the right way? I might be doing this wrong. And so even if you go through the training, it tells you everything that you already know. You've got that like psychological tick in the box to go, right, I'm doing the right thing here, and I'm not messing something up. And so I think, I've had that feedback quite a few times from people, like, how do we make the product better? It's like, make it more intuitive, and then you don't need the training. So I think you kind of still do, actually.
I just don't buy that. I get maybe there are things we're normalized to in the way certain things work, and those design principles can help make it more easy to navigate something. But when you're talking about sort of a complex process of, within a business, which is sort of developed over time, and a software piece coming in to support that, the nuances, the people and the process, the technology is just, you can make it intuitive. You can go, oh, if I click that, I know it's going to do a drop down menu. That's intuitive. That's what I come to expect.
Yeah.
But you can't, I don't think you can train people for intuition around how something gets done, right? Because they're expecting something and they're seeing something brand new. So I think it's a bit of a cop out to say we can design systems to be intuitive for the purpose and benefit of the end user in the way I think people are trying to sell it. I just don't think you can. And the reality is people only really get used to something once they play with it, once they've had a chance to navigate it and actually operate it for themselves in the way that they expect to. And actually that's where a lot of good feedback from, system implementation comes, is actually having real users use it in a way that they would use it in the business, right, and seeing how that does or doesn't work, and then addressing it with them, right. That is so important to adoption, right? Not just keep going, it's an intuitive system, just figure it out. That's not going to get adoption at all.
It does bring to mind the idea that not everything that we need to change needs a massive project behind it. Some things we can kind of get away with maybe doing a little bit less, some things need more. So if I'm a senior leader in an accounting practice, how do I know what I'm doing? How do I know if what I'm doing needs this sort of work behind it? How do I know how much effort needs to go into planning this project?
That's a really good question, actually. I was only earlier this week talking about sort of roles and responsibilities you find in different size projects. And I think, like, for me, complexity is made up of sort of two things. One is, how long do we think this is going to take to implement? Like, and how many people does it impact?
Okay.
And sort of the more people it impacts, more systems it touches or process, more touch points it has in a process, right? The more complex by nature it is. And almost certainly it's going to take longer for us to unpick and sort of address. So it naturally lends itself to someone having people dedicated to thinking about this sort of full time. So I kind of think, if you're looking, I've done quite a few sort of team-based process improvements where, we're getting this data in from that person at this time, but it's in a different format to what we actually need it in. What can we do to improve that? Or, this client wants this report 3 days earlier, but our cycle doesn't work for that. What can we do to give them an early version of that report? Those sorts of improvements we can kind of tinker with within our own team, within our own kind of remit, with a select group of people, and we can isolate the impacts. That for me is how we kind of size and scale stuff. Like, the more people it touches and the more systems it touches across the organization, the more dedicated resource you want on it to figure it out. Because what you don't want to do is start tinkering with something and loads of business processes fall over, right? And that no one's going to thank you for that. Yeah. So it just comes down to that, right? Like, actually, how complex is this, what we're trying to do? Do we really understand it? Can we chart it out? Can we see what parts of the system we're going to be touching? And actually, if I go into a business, it's not often I get at the very beginning when technology is being implemented, but I'm always interested in what's the process flow. Like, I'm always interested in, okay, right, brilliant, we start over here, person A does this, they hand that over to person B, it goes through this data cleaning exercise, gets stored here, we wait for that to come in. I want to know the journey of the data, the people and the process and the policies, because that way I can start to go, right, well, if we took that bit out, brilliant, we break that and that. Well, okay, how complex is that? Well, 17 or 20 people are involved. And they get a feel for it. How complex is it? But you do need to start with, what does it look like today? Because otherwise you can't redesign for what it looks like in the future. And then you can't do a difference to say, okay, well, I understand how it's going to impact people. And, bread and butter stuff for change manager is really, okay, what are the change impacts? Where how and why am I impacting people?
And I think so there's definitely some examples that jump to mind of firms that do that, and it where I've seen it, it looks like someone in a boardroom with just a load of sticky notes on the wall, right, and just trying to just move them around and discussing it that way. But that's a really good way just to take that like initial step back and go, right, well, okay, how significant is this thing that we're going to change?
Yeah.
One of the things that I picked out as well in the old days, like a couple of years ago, just trying to implement stuff, is that you've got this connect, right? You've got people that make the decision at the top. And when we were selling, you just try and go and get the decision maker, right? So the most senior person in the practice go, right, we're going to do this project. Yes, great, perfect. And then almost you've got to come down the hierarchy again to the people that are actually going to implement. But the bit missing was the sort of line managers in the middle. And you mentioned something in a post the other day about kind of coaching people through that and building that capability to coach those line managers so that they could support those people at the bottom. And I think that tends to be an area that firms might struggle with a little bit, having that kind of coaching capability in there. Like, how impactful is that when you've got that in place, where you've got that coaching discipline ready to go? How much of a difference does that make, do you find, in sort of change projects?
I'm not sure how much, unless you're going to ask your line managers within a business to be the change leads, right? Yeah. To actually push the change through themselves, which I think is where businesses should go, to be honest with you. Like, we should have our line managers capable of driving the changes we want, but we also need to give them the capacity to do that role, right? We can't just ask them to do it in addition to everything else they're doing and not break anything that is currently our business as usual, right? Like, that's what most businesses ask their line managers, and it's no wonder that change finds it difficult to actually get implemented, because there's just no capacity in that middle layer. So what often happens is someone like me will come in that middle layer and provide that additional capacity to those managers to provide them the support to get things done. But the coaching element really is, from my perspective, to kind of help them see that change is possible, that if people are asking us above us to do above and beyond what we're doing, well, there's probably going to be introduced some risk, right? So I'm going to tell you what that risk is. Do you know what? I remember I was implementing Salesforce for an organization, and we were transitioning all the sort of tiered client groups, and we thought our service levels would drop. But no one said it was okay for service levels to drop. And I said, well, no, what we're going to do is we're going to say, by the way, we recognize if we're going to make this change, that service levels will drop for this period of time, and it will largely affect this group of clients, right? We're going in eyes wide open. You want us to make this change? That's what we're doing. Yeah. We're going to try not to make it happen. We're going to try not to let it impact that group, but we know that it might, and we know what we might do if it happens. It's a very different story. It's going back to that kind of eyes wide open.
Yeah.
When leaders realize that, they're kind of, and when you know it as a kind of risk, you're more cognizant to try not let it happen. So you work that little bit harder to try and not let it happen. And so that way it's not consuming you, like, I can't keep all of this the same and I can't deliver this. It's like, some of this might fail. It's okay, because I'm getting this instead. That's the trade-off I'm giving you. And I think that's where sort of line managers can push back a little with their superiors, right? Like, I'm very happy to support putting this through. I'm very happy to get my people to do stuff, but we're going to introduce risk to the business, and I'm going to tell you where it is, and we're going to mitigate it. But it is going to introduce risk if you really want this change, because you're not giving me any extra time or people. So I think that's where sort of coaching that kind of mindset in the middle is where I've kind of found the most value.
Feels like there's a really nice opportunity to enable those line managers to see obstacles in the road not as an obstacle, but maybe it's just a fork in the road, right? But they just need to go back and get some buy-in to, like, we're going to go left or right here, and here's the consequences of each. But I guess it goes back to that point earlier on that you mentioned around giving a sponsor or giving a leader a decision to make. Go, actually, we're going to do this or do this, and here's, and kind of inform them on both. But I guess the other element, like inherently in there, is that feedback loop as well. If we're not hearing that stuff back from those people, if it's just that email push, going back to the communication from earlier on, well, they're just going to have to go and figure that out themselves, rather than have that opportunity to come and say, well, as you've described there, which way do you want to go?
Yeah, and I think, like we always talk about in sort of good change, needing good leadership and effective sponsorship, right? People who you can go to when you've got problems. And I think that the reason it's such a critical element is that you are inherently introducing risk, right, to what you do today. And so you need support for that, because if we really want it, otherwise it's just someone in the middle trying to make do with all the different challenges they've got, right? And the pressure's on them, right? And there's no support to them. And that's where, if you think also, then they're challenged by the fact that they've got to support their teams, and their teams have got stuff to do. All of a sudden that becomes quite a big burden for people in the middle, like squeezed at both ends. So I think there is the natural need for us to lean on our line managers, right, to be that support to ourselves. And what you find is that middle layer is very good at supporting the teams below, but not very good at pushing back up, right, and saying, well, make a choice, right? Which is it you want me to do, or where should I focus my time, or are you okay with this thing not being done this month, just while we get on with that? So leading those sorts of conversations for me is sort of, easy for people to do, maybe uncomfortable. I think that's the thing. It's uncomfortable to be the one to help uncover the challenges, but you're not doing it because you want people to feel more fear. You want to try and create a level of certainty and openness and transparency about what you're being asked to do, so that everyone understands, everyone feels like they've got the same information. And I think that's probably, for me, the easiest step, right? Try and bring some commonality to understanding. It goes back to communication, right? What do I understand of the change? What does someone else understand? Do we see the same risks? Do you have a different viewpoint? So I do think that for me is kind of the first point. Try and, with your team, when you're being asked to do something, look at what do the risks actually present to you, get them out on the table, get a discussion going around how they will impact you as a team, where you might find stumbling blocks, and then I think one of the most important things is, when we find them, find positive ways to address them, so that we're kind of not going with problems, right? Don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. But like, if you go to your line manager with this kind of like, hey, we've had to think about this, and this is where we see some of the challenges, I think what's almost expected, or I would expect, is, okay, and this is what we can do about them. What do you like? Again, option A, option B, option C. Which one do you want us to do? And I think that being able to facilitate that discussion with your team and then present it back to people above you is the skill. That's the skill we're trying to develop. And I think everyone's capable of doing that if they can sort of get okay with the discomfort of being that person. And it is the discomfort of being in that situation.
Yeah. Definitely. It's one of the things from, what is it, the 5 dysfunctions of a team, is like that trust, and therefore the conflict that can arise from that. But that's how we move each other forwards, right?
Yeah.
Ket, thank you so much for your time. That's been absolutely fantastic, and there's a bunch of gold in there for people to go away and start to think about in their projects. If people want to find out more about your work, or get in touch, or follow you, how's the best way for them to do that?
Best thing to do is find me on LinkedIn, Ket Patel, or Change Agitator. I think both of them will find me. I'm also the organization I currently consult for, called Marlowe Consulting. And soon, at some point in the near future, you should be able to find an organization of which I'll be the founder of, a company called Change Reaction, where we're trying to help young fledgling people in the project profession come into the profession and find their feet and find a career path.
Fantastic. That sounds great. Ket, once again, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. And
no worries. It's really good to speak to you, mate. Yeah, cheers. See you later.
Thanks again to Ket for his advice there. I'm sure there's something useful and actionable there for anyone that's involved in digital transformation. For more sessions like this, be sure to subscribe or check out the playlist linked in the description to find other Counting on Change videos and interviews.